Okay, think about the last time you cleaned out your closet.
Mm-hmm.
You bag up all those old clothes, maybe stuff you haven't worn forever, drop them at a donation bin.
Yeah.
And you feel pretty good.
Yeah, like you've done your bit, helped someone, kept textiles out of landfill.
Exactly. But what if that's not quite the whole picture?
That's exactly what we're getting into today. We're going to look at what actually happens after those bags leave your site. Specifically, this whole world of secondhand clothing exports, mainly from the U.S.
Right.
And it's a journey with some surprising parts and, frankly, some pretty negative consequences sometimes.
Yeah, we've looked into some information that really pulls back the curtain on this global trade.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really get a handle on where our donated clothes actually go and, the impact this huge multi-billion-dollar industry has.
Okay, so let's start with a term you might not know, but it says a lot. Dead white man's clothes.
What?
Yeah. It's what people in places like Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania often call the bales of secondhand clothing arriving from the West.
Dead white man's clothes.
Hmm.
That's quite a name.
It is. And it's not just a label. It signifies something deeper, this one-way street of unwanted stuff that totally reshapes local markets, even local culture.
It really paints a picture. And it makes you think, especially when you hear that only 10 to 20% of donated clothes are actually sold here in U.S. thrift stores?
That's the statistic, yeah. Which immediately raises the question.
Where does the other 80 or 90% go?
Exactly. It goes overseas, shipped out in massive volumes, creating this enormous global industry, but one with some serious knock-on effects.
And one of the biggest is the damage to local textile industries in the countries getting all these clothes.
Right. We looked at work by economist Dr. Akosua Kumi, and she describes how this flood of super cheap used clothing has basically decimated local industry.
Decimated, that's strong.
It is. She points to places like Nigeria, Uganda, where local factories just couldn't compete. They had to shut down.
Because the imported stuff is just so cheap.
They're cheap. And it's not just the factories. Think about, local tailors, artisans, people making traditional fabrics.
You can't possibly compete with those prices either.
No chance. They're struggling to make a living against this constant tide of secondhand imports.
And Dr. Kumi also talks about something maybe less obvious, cultural erasure.
Explain that a bit.
Well, the idea that when a community loses its ability to make its own traditional textiles, the clothes that are part of its identity, its history, it loses a piece of itself.
That makes sense. It's more than just economics then.
Definitely.
So, okay, we've got the economic impact, the cultural impact, but there's another layer here, isn't there, about what's actually in those bales of clothing being shipped.
Yeah, this is where it gets pretty concerning. Beyond just the sheer volume overwhelming markets, there's the question of the condition and content.
What is we talking about here?
Well, reports mention finding things you really wouldn't expect or want. Mold, for instance. Various chemicals. Even clothes contaminated with, bodily fluids.
Seriously, that's unpleasant and potentially hazardous.
Exactly. And there are even accounts suggesting clothes from deceased people end up in these shipments without any real checking or cleaning.
Wow. So no real inspection process on that front.
It seems inconsistent at best. We saw this one journalist report with some really disturbing examples.
Like what?
Like a worker sorting clothes in Kenya, finding a wedding dress just caked in mud and blood.
Oh, it's awful.
Or children's pajamas that were soaked in bleach, things like that.
You have to think about the people doing that sorting, the workers.
Absolutely. What are the conditions like for them?
Often really tough. They're exposed to potentially toxic fumes from mold or chemicals, handling these hazardous materials you mentioned, working long, long hours.
For very little pay, I imagine.
Usually, yes. It's almost like they're acting as, unpaid garbage disposers for Western consumption, cleaning up our unwanted stuff.
That's a harsh way to put it, but it sounds accurate based on this. It's the unseen human cost.
Definitely. And then there's the environmental side in those countries, too. A lot of this clothing, maybe it's too damaged or just doesn't sell.
What happens to it then?
It often ends up getting burned in open fires, releasing fumes, or just dumped in overflowing landfills.
So it adds to pollution problems there.
Exactly. It creates the sort of toxic loop we donate to avoid waste here, but a lot of it just becomes waste and pollution somewhere else, often in places less equipped to handle it.
Okay, so if the donors mean well, but the recipients are often harmed economically and environmentally, who's actually profiting from this system? Where's the money going?
That really is the core question, isn't it? It's generally not the person donating or the person ultimately receiving the worn garment.
So who then?
The main beneficiaries are the middlemen, essentially. The exporters, often based here in the West, who buy the clothes cheaply, maybe by weight, from donation centers or sorters.
Right.
Then the importers in the receiving countries who buy these huge bales, and then the various traders and sellers down the line.
So there's a whole chain making money off these clothes.
Yes. And it's a huge business. We're talking billions of dollars circulating globally in this trade every year.
Billions.
Yeah.
But very little of that seems to actually benefit the communities dealing with the negative impacts we discussed.
That seems to be the case. We saw comments from an environmental activist, Sarah Thompson, who really highlighted the irony.
What was her take?
She pointed out that people donate thinking they're reducing waste, being green, but often it just relocates the waste problem. It doesn't solve it. It just shifts the burden.
Right, creating that toxic loop you mentioned.
Exactly. And she connects it directly to the bigger issue of fast fashion.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, the sheer volume of cheap clothes being produced encourages us to buy more and dispose of it faster. That overproduction and overconsumption is what fuels this massive flow of donations in the first place.
So donating is kind of like a release valve for fast fashion's excesses, but it doesn't fix the root cause.
Precisely. It's often treating a symptom, not the disease of overconsumption itself.
Okay, so this is clearly complex with lots of unintended negative consequences. What can actually be done? Are there solutions?
It's tough, but yeah, there are things to consider. One big area has to be transparency, right?
Meaning?
Meaning donors should ideally have a clearer idea of where their clothes are actually going, what percentage is sold locally versus exported, what happens to exported clothes. It's hard information to get right now.
Yeah, it usually just disappears into a bin.
Yeah.
Okay, so more transparency. What else?
Well, there could be a role for maybe government regulations, putting stricter rules on the exporters.
Like what kind of rules?
Ensuring minimum quality standards, perhaps. Making sure shipments aren't just full of unusable rags or hazardous items. Basically stopping the export of waste disguised as donations.
Okay, that makes sense. But regulations can be slow. What about on our end as consumers?
That's crucial. A big part of this comes down to individual responsibility and choices.
How so?
Well, first, maybe don't just automatically donate everything. Think about other options first.
Like repairing something.
Exactly. Repairing, repurposing it into something else, maybe trying to resell it locally through consignment shops, online platforms, whatever. Keeping it in use closer to home.
Right. Give it a longer life here first.
Yeah. And then when we do buy clothes, being more mindful.
Thinking about sustainability.
Yes, maybe supporting brands that are trying to be more ethical, making clothes that are designed to last longer rather than falling apart after a few washes, buying less but better quality.
Tackling that fast fashion consumption pattern we talked about.
Exactly. And finally, we can also advocate for change.
How?
Supporting policies or organizations that are working to protect garment workers, both in production and in the secondhand trade, and pushing for better environmental standards across the board.
So it's clear this whole secondhand clothing journey is way more complicated and honestly kind of uncomfortable than just dropping off a bag of clothes.
It really is. That simple act has ripples that spread across the globe, affecting economies, environments, people's health.
It really forces you to think about that choice. Every donation, every purchase, it has consequences down the line. So the question really becomes, are we okay with participating in a system that often seems to put profit ahead of people and the planet? Or do we start demanding more accountability?
And work towards solutions that are genuinely helpful and sustainable, not just shifting the problem.
Yeah, there's that saying, every thread tells a story.
Let's try and make sure the stories our clothes tell are, ones we can actually feel good about, ones worth telling.